Okay, so looks like we started. Good morning, everyone. I trust you can all hear me. We are here with Sergio, and my name is Simona. We are working in FEANTSA, and we're going to host this webinar today. Welcome and thank you for your interest. Today's webinar is on homelessness among mobile EU citizens, and I will start to share the screen for you to be able to see a short introduction to the webinar and to the speakers. So yeah, we are joined today by 3 experienced speakers in the field of EU migration. But before that, I would like to start by going a little bit through the technicalities. I'll just remind everyone that the webinar today is, it will last 1 hour, and attendees are muted in this period, but we will very much like to encourage everyone to send their questions in writing in the chat box or in the Q&A section. And we will do our best to answer them in the time that we have available. And I'll also like to let you know that the webinar is recorded, and we will circulate a link later on with the recording and the presentations that you will see today from our speakers. An email will be sent to all those who registered for the webinar. And shortly to introduce the speakers, today we have with us Mauro Striano, who has over 10 years experience in working with migration policies. He is now working as a program manager with Brus Help, which is the organization in Brussels who coordinates emergency aid and integration mechanisms for homeless people in Brussels capital region. And Mauro will share with us highlights from the report that he wrote on the factors contributing to vulnerability among destitute mobile EU citizens in Brussels. And next we will hear from Martin Enquist-Kolken and Fabrizio Vittoria, who are both lawyers with Momentous LPA in Sweden. Martin and Fabrizio are both specialized in EU law and have prepared a fitness check report for Sweden, analyzing how the EU Directive on EU free movement is transposed at national level. And very shortly, also before going to the presentation, I want to briefly remind everyone that FEANTSA is a membership organization. And we have recently changed our structure, which means that we are looking to have a broader coalition. Foundations, cities, and research institutes think tanks are now eligible to join us as members. So if you want to become a member with us, please do not hesitate to contact us for more information. As a member, you can help feed into our policy work. You can participate in the thematic clusters, such as the migration cluster, the one working on women's homelessness, on youth homelessness, or LGBTI homelessness. And then you can also exchange best practices and become part of this European network that works for ending homelessness. Just to add that this is a great time to join us, because in 2021, the European Commission will launch a European platform on homelessness, and FEANTSA will follow the developments very closely and directly. So please contact us for more information. And one last thing from my side, I would just like to share with you the setting in which the context in which we are having today's webinar. And this is the PRODEC project, Protecting the Rights of Destitute Mobile EU Citizens is a project implemented by FEANTSA with funding from EPIM, European Programme on Integration and Migration. And the first phase of PRODEC has ended in 2019 We are now implementing the second phase, which will last until the end of 2021. Our main objectives within PRODEC are to contribute to the available information regarding mobile EU citizens. And for this purpose, we will be collecting data on destitute mobile EU citizens in 4 cities, namely in Brussels, Barcelona, Münster, and Stockholm. We also aim to create durable links between homeless service providers and lawyers. And we intend to raise awareness on the one hand of litigation opportunities among professionals working with destitute mobile EU citizens, and on the other hand of homelessness issues among legal experts. We will work within this framework to identify also existing good practices related to services supporting destitute mobile EU citizens, and we will try to involve and determine more local authorities to address the homelessness issue among mobile EU citizens. So with that being said, I would just like to invite Mauro to take the floor and give us his presentation on the factors that push mobile EU citizens to a life in destitutions and the situation in Brussels. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen so that you can all see my presentation. Can you see it? I suppose so. Thanks for the invitation. I'm Mauro Striano and I work as Policy and Research Officer at Brussels, which is a public law organization in charge, among other things, of coordinating the Brussels homeless sector. So, within the framework of the PRODEC project, which was presented by Simona, FEANTSA realized that in dealing with homelessness among mobile citizens, what is often missing is qualitative information. So more specific data about this particular group, mobile citizens, would help form a better understanding of what the biggest challenges are and inform policy in a more efficient way. So at a certain moment, project partners agreed to carry out a pilot data collection exercise in Brussels, building on the work of Diogène. So Diogène is a street work and outreach service in Brussels. It's one of the biggest street work service. And the data collected in this research covered 2018. We are currently preparing the report on the data of 2019, but it's still not ready. So here, what I'm going to present is really about the 2018, which was the first year in which there were more people from other European member states using Diogène services than there were Belgian nationals. So in 2018, Diogène supported 990 individuals and collected files about 531. Out of 531 people of which the nationality is known, 228 were mobile citizens, 225 were Belgians, and 78 were third country nationals. So in addition to the variables that Diogène were already collecting, such as demographic information, type of income, alcohol and drug misuse, mental health needs, and housing situation, it was agreed to collect data about immigration status, reasons for migration, household type, use of emergency services, and also what's very important, the possession of health insurance. As you can imagine, I won't be able today to tell you about all the variables that were analyzed. For those who are interested, I invite you to read the full report, which is available in English, Dutch, and French. It's available in the FEANTSA website and also in the Brussels website. And a last remark before I actually start presenting some of the results is that the information gathered only concerns the beneficiaries who were accompanied by Diogène, which is one, as I say, one of the many homeless services existing in Brussels. It is therefore not comprehensive and provides only a partial, but in my opinion, reliable picture of homelessness among mobile citizens in Brussels. Okay, so in terms of nationalities, as you can see from this graph, the overwhelming majority come from Poland and Romania. These two nationalities together make up almost 80% of the total sample. There is no clear explanation as to why there is such a marked presence of Poles and Romanians among homeless people in Brussels. However, one key reason is the steep increase in the number of Polish and Romanian nationals arriving in Belgium over the past 10 to 15 years. Just to give you an example, in the Brussels region in 2008, so 12 years ago, Romanians did not even appear among the 5 most present EU nationalities and accounted for less than 5% of the migrant population. In contrast, in 2017, Romanian was the second most common migrant nationality in Brussels after the French. So making up around 9% of the migrant population, which is around 40,000 Romanian nationals. So, according to the information available, 85% of the people included in the database moved to Belgium to look for a job. However, only 9%, most of whom without a contract, so in the undeclared labor market, have been working, which suggests that access to employment is particularly challenging. The reasons are many, and we will need to analyze them in depth, which we haven't done yet, but a few arguments could be put forward. The first is the level of, let's say, of preparation individuals had before moving to Belgium in terms of language and professional skills. The second is the availability of a safety net in case things don't go as planned. And by that, I mean a formal safety net, such as social benefits and in general, access to adequate services, and an informal safety net, which is the family or the community. And of course, for nationalities of which the increase was very recent, the existence of a community of families is, let's say, less than what it would be, for instance, for Italian nationals or French nationals, which have an history of migration to Belgium for several decades. As we will see later, most of the mobile citizens accompanied by Diogene are irregular residing, meaning they don't have an address and could not register at the municipality, which entails that they cannot access employment services provided by Actiris, which is the regional Brussels job office. The difficult living conditions and the lack of adequate services make them vulnerable to exploitation, of course. They are very likely to work in the undeclared labor market and to take up precarious jobs, which of course, as a consequence, has the fact that they don't have access to the social welfare. On top of this, as it was shown in a report published by FEANTSA on the implementation of the notion of worker in Belgium, well, actually, the report was about Belgium, Germany, and the UK, but now I'm referring only to Belgium. So often what happens is the municipalities often refuse to register as workers mobile citizens who are on short-term or atypical contracts. Normally, what they use, even though it's not really something that it's written in the law, they use the 12 hours threshold. So which means that people working for less than 12 hours a week, they are not considered as workers, so they don't have access to social welfare. So, income. So, as you might guess, lack of income is the main reason for poverty and exclusion among mobile citizens. And as you can see from this graph, information regarding income suggests that the majority, more than 60%, don't have any kind of income, while only 15% have access to a minimum income, which is called RIS in French, and it depends on whether you live as isolated in the household or if you live with the family. But in any case, this is only concerns only 15% of the target group we are taking here in consideration, and only around 9% has an income generated by an economic activity. So, not having an income, as to be expected, is the main path into rough sleeping. Among the mobile citizens that Diogene supports, 70% of those who don't have any kind of income sleep rough. In that sense, it's interesting to compare this data with data concerning individuals who actually get a minimum income. So, next graph. Those who have more access to private housing are actually those who receive the minimum income allowance, with 62% of these people living in an apartment. However, and it's also interesting to remark that, is that obtaining the minimum income does not prevent people from sleeping rough. As you can see, 15% of them, they don't have any place to live, even though they get a minimum income. So, as mentioned earlier, the big majority of the mobile citizens supported by Diogene is irregular residing, 72.4%. This means that most of the people included in this data collection were not able to register at the municipality since they don't have an address. In Brussels, it exists the possibility for a homeless person to get a referral address, adresse de référence, in a public social service center, the CPS, and have access in this way to social rights. However, this option is valid for those who had an address in Belgium at a certain time of their life, which is very unlikely for a homeless person who is not Belgian. So not having a regular immigration status has, of course, a strong impact on various aspects of the individual's lives. Mobile citizens with no right to reside are mostly cut off from any kind of income. 78% don't have any kind of income, are overrepresented among people sleeping rough, 64%, are not covered by health insurance. They mostly rely on emergency healthcare, which is often very hard to get. And of course, they are more likely to use emergency accommodation and emergency health services. So, as over the last few months, the question of access to healthcare is even more important since we are living through a health crisis. And as you can see from this graph, only a small part of the sample is 14% is covered by health insurance. So the majority is not covered, though a large proportion, 51%, has at a certain moment of their life received healthcare services through the emergency healthcare system, which is called aide médicale urgente. This emergency medical help involves financial support by a public social service center, which covers the costs, the health costs of a person who is not regularly residing. The procedure to get this kind of support is often very complicated. So having no income has, of course, a significant impact on people's ability to access health insurance. The data suggests that access to medical insurance remains a huge challenge, and that only by having a job with an employment contract, of course, it's possible to be insured. Among those who work without a contract, and even those who rely on the minimum income, the most used option is actually emergency healthcare. So the combination of lack of residence status, lack of income, and poor or no housing puts people in an extremely vulnerable position, which might last for many years. So the category of mobile citizens who are the most destitute are also those who use emergency accommodation the most and are hospitalized most often. So to conclude, one of the main features of this target group is the likelihood of getting into a vicious circle where the absence of a job entails the absence of an income, then leads to the absence of housing and of an address, the impossibility of obtaining a residence permit, and as a consequence, the impossibility of accessing services and welfare benefits. For many, this situation is protracted for many years. It becomes chronic and pushes people to the point of no return. over time problem that if tackled early on could have been solved become insurmountable and drive people into extreme social exclusion. So to break this vicious circle, it is extremely important that these people have access to a residence permit. This often paves the way for access to essential services and the welfare benefits. A safety net, like minimum income, for instance, is in many cases a way into social inclusion. The absence of a regular immigration status, particularly when this is the case for many years, tends to coincide with very serious health problems, including mental health and substance misuse. I couldn't go into this in these 15 minutes, but in the report you will find many information relating to how the situation degrades over time in terms of mental health and health, especially for those who are for a long time irregularly residing. Last point is the absence of health insurance is a major problem. Only having access to emergency health treatment puts people's health in danger, since they often must wait until their conditions become serious enough for them to be able to access treatment. So thank you for your attention, and if you have any question or you need any further information, please don't hesitate to contact me.
Thank you, Mauro. Yes, thank you for these details. Very interesting to hear from the capital of Belgium. And I think I would like to encourage everyone once again to send in writing your questions for Mauro. We will be able to address them at the end of the presentations. Yes, and please, Fabrizio and Martin, whenever you're ready, please take over and start telling us about the situation in Sweden from a more legal perspective. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and it's nice to be here, and thank you for the invitation to present here, Simona. I will share the screen, and this is the first time I share screen on the Zoom, so we will see. Fabrizio, can you share the presentation instead? I'm sorry. I'm sorry for this. No.
Yes. I think that was
And
great.
could you put it on in presentation, Fabrizio? And from the beginning then. So, sorry for this. I haven't shared a presentation on my Apple computer before, and it gave some sort of system that I needed to restart the system. So hopefully this will work with Fabrizio sharing instead. We have, within the PRODEC project, we have provided FEANTSA with the fitness check report for Sweden. And what is a fitness check? Well, it is, as it stands there, it's a review of the state of compliance of Sweden's implementation of Directive 2004/38 on residency rights. So basically, it is a legal analysis of whether the Swedish implementation fulfills the purpose of the directive and also the material provisions within the directive. And our presentation, the fitness check itself, you can read it on, you can find it at FEANTSA's homepage. But the fitness check itself contains lots of different parts concerning different provisions. But in this presentation, we will focus on four parts, which is, firstly, we will provide a background and a timeline of the transposition. We will also present the application of the EU law concept of the notion of worker within Swedish law. We will also look at the Swedish Population Registration Act and present how it impacts the access to social rights for EU citizens. So can you move forward, Fabrizio? Concerning the background and timeline, the directive was transposed into Swedish legislation in 2006, and unfortunately it was transposed quite poorly. This led the Commission to launch a review of the transposition in 2008, where the Commission found that the Swedish transposition contained several inconsistencies. This was followed by a review by the European Parliament in 2009, where the European Parliament found that the Swedish transposition was rather imperfect and could be improved. In 2014, the Swedish government decided to correct the errors from the 2006 transposition. So it took 8 years for the government to act. And in 2014, several amendments were made in order to comply with the provisions of the directive. One interesting amendment concerns the registration or a registration formality for EU citizens when they came to Sweden. Because originally the directive was transposed with a requirement for EU citizens to register at the Swedish Migration Agency if they intended to stay in Sweden for a period longer than 3 months. The reason for this, the government asserted, was to safeguard the risk of different agencies making different assessments of the residency rights criteria. And the government held that without the registration procedure, different agencies would come to different conclusions on which ground an EU citizen derived residency rights from. However, holding a registration of a residency right from the Swedish Migration Agency was not a proof of having the right to residency. Rather, the registration was used as an indicative guidance for other agencies when they assessed on which ground an EU citizen had residency rights. Furthermore, the problematic aspect of this registration formality was that it was not compatible with the directive. Because in Article 181 and 82 of the directive, member states can oblige EU citizens to register, but only for periods of residence longer than 3 months. And the deadline for registration cannot be set at less than 3 months from the arrival date into Sweden. And since the Swedish requirement held that you needed to go if you intended to stay for longer than 3 months, this registration formality was considered to not be compatible with the directive. What is interesting is that when it was removed, several stakeholders raised concerns that without the registration formality, the interpretation of residency rights criteria would be applied differently at different agencies. And the Swedish Board of Trade, which is the competent solvent authority in Sweden, raised the opinion that already the interpretation of the criteria for the right to reside is applied differently, and this creates obstacles to the free movement of persons. So even before the registration formality were removed, there were severe problems with different interpretations on ground for residency rights. And one ground for residency right is being a worker. So I think that we should move forward to our case-by-case analysis on the notion of worker in Sweden. Firstly, I just want to say something briefly about the concept of worker within EU law. There are several court cases defining the notion of worker in different ways, but basically a a worker for the purpose of EU law is a person that for a certain period of time performs services for another under the direction of another person in return for remuneration. And the activities must be genuine and effective, meaning they can't be marginal or ancillary. And well, as I said, there are many court cases. One important case is the Genk case from the Court of Justice, which basically, where the court established that 5.5 hours a week and 7.8 euro per hour can be enough to fulfill the notion of worker. So we did the assessment, what is the interpretation of the notion of worker within the Swedish legal framework? And we did it through a case-by-case analysis and an assessment of the governmental guidelines or relevant governmental guidelines. One problem that we found was that the notion of worker is not defined at all in national law. There is no interpretation of the notion of worker within national law. Neither is there any, there's no Supreme Administrative Court ruling on the notion of worker. And this leads to a situation where we find different interpretation of the concepts. The Migration Court of Appeal has ruled on the notion of worker 2 times, and there are also several cases from the Administrative Courts of Appeal. However, they don't have legal precedence. And looking at the court cases, they don't really give that much information about how should the notion of worker be interpreted in Swedish law. The Migration Court of Appeal has held that it is enough to show part-time employment for several months, and that it's not necessary for a worker to be able to support him or herself. The Administrative Courts of Appeal, there are several cases, and they differ a lot. So I just wanted to give 2 examples. The Administrative Courts of Appeal has ruled that cleaning for the remuneration of rental costs did not fulfill the notion of worker, and also selling magazines on the streets, earning 250 to 300 euros per month, did not fulfill the notion of worker. There is not really any formal minimum threshold within the Swedish legal framework concerning hours or reimbursement. However, we see that it is difficult for workers in precarious working conditions and with atypical employment contracts to meet the criteria or fulfill the criteria for the notion of workers. One big problem that we could see within the case-by-case analysis is that several court cases are lacking an overall analysis of the actual circumstances of both the nature and activities concerned within the employment. Basically, they don't assess whether the actual work is real and genuine. When we looked at the governmental agency guidelines, we could see that several governmental agencies provided guidelines that fulfill the criteria for the notion of worker within for the purpose of EU law. However, one agency is quite problematic, and it is the Swedish Tax Agency, because the Swedish Tax Agency asserts that the nature of the employment contract can affect whether an EU citizen should be considered a worker. And in relation to this, they assert that it is not enough to provide a 0-hour contract in order to prove or in order to fulfill the criteria for the notion of worker. Rather, an EU citizen must be able to show that work has been taken place and prove guaranteed future work. And considering the nature of a 0-hour contract, which legally, legally a 0-hour contract starts, the employment starts when you when you come to work that day, and the employment ends when you finish your work that day. It's impossible to prove future guaranteed work with such a contract. The tax agency also holds that EU citizen must be able to show that the employer has a stable financial situation. Otherwise, the tax agency might question the future duration of the employment. Overall, we can see that the tax agency guidelines indicate that the agency use a sort of dual assessment of for the purpose of the notional worker, where they, on one hand, they assess whether a person fulfills the criteria for the notional worker as is established by the Court of Justice. However, in the same time, they also assess whether a worker fulfills the criteria for the Swedish Population Registration Act. And well, this is not coherent with EU law, and Fabrizio will talk more about this now.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Martin. I will focus my presentation, my slides, on two main aspects. The first one is, as Martin said, the Swedish Population Registration Act, and in particular, as you can see, the personnummer issue, the social security number, the one-year rule, and the equal treatment principle. So basically, the relation between the Swedish Population Registration Act and the free movement rights and legislation at European, at the national level. And the second part of the presentation will try to give you an overview of the impact on access to social rights, for instance, social assistance, healthcare, and social benefits. I have unfortunately stopped to share the presentation because I have a slow Wi-Fi connection. Is it okay, Simona?
We can see your presentation?
No, I have to stop to share the presentation because I have a slow Wi-Fi connection. Is that okay?
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So, and as I regard the first part of my presentation, the Swedish Population Registration Act, what does it actually mean? Once the person, the European citizens, decide to move to Sweden, the first step is to actually register as a resident at the Swedish tax agency, as Martin said, and obtaining the so-called personnummer, the social security number. Well, this obligation is stated by the Swedish law in the Population Registration Act, or Folkbokföringslagen in Swedish, in the section 3, which is the purpose of the registration. To determine, the Skatteverket has to determine if and where a person is to be considered a resident, but there is also an additional purpose, which is to understand, to be able to keep correct and update personal data of basic nature in the system. Given those two purposes, of course, the fact that the person has the obligation to register at the Swedish tax agency in order to obtain a social security number, it's a quite important step for European citizens, given that the social security number, the personnummer, is provided to European citizens as well to all the persons residing in Sweden, access to all, let's say, almost all public and private services. And the fact that there are many obstacles registering your residence at the Swedish tax agency will, of course, have an impact on the daily life for European citizens. As mentioned earlier, in the section 3 of the Population Registration Law, there is a very important provision stating the so-called one-year rule. what is the 1-year rule? It's actually the person is considered a resident in Sweden when he is likely to be routinely spending the leisure time in the country, in Sweden, for at least 1 year. So you can understand that, of course, this can be a problem from a legal perspective, point of view. And what does it mean to be routinely spending the leisure time in Sweden? Of course, you have to be at least once a week on the Swedish territory in order to be considered as a resident. Let's say that from a formal point of view, this provision is applicable to both Swedish citizens as well as European citizens. So we can say that there is no direct discrimination towards European citizens and the impossibility to register as a resident in Sweden. However, the Section 4 of the same Population Registration Act is stating that in order to register in this Skatteverket system and to obtain a personal number, you have also to prove your right of residence as foreign person, so as a European citizen, not being a Swedish citizen. Which means in practice that the European citizen moving to Sweden has to prove a right of residence in advance for at least 1 year. So let's say, let's do a practical example. If I'm a worker, I want to stay in Sweden, I want to work in Sweden, I register in a Swedish tax agency, you will be denied the Personnummer if your employment contract will be less than 1 year, because of those two provisions I explained to you before. The fact that you have to stay in Sweden for at least 1 year, you have to prove your right of residence for at least 1 year. The practical application by Skatteverket, the Swedish tax agency, of those two provisions, imposing restricting condition on EU citizens once they apply for a Personnummer and try to be a resident in Sweden, of course, is having an impact on the daily life for European citizens. Of course, this is not only for workers, it's of course even, for example, job seekers that per se they are not able to register at the Swedish tax agency because they are only able to look for a job for 6 months. So they are automatically excluded for the possibility to be registered to prove their right of residence for at least 1 year. So you can imagine the strong, the very restriction applied by Skatteverket. But as well as to other categories, as students, for example, pensioners, if they fail to demonstrate their intention to reside for over a year. We can see, and we have been going through in the legal fitness check as well, there have been many complaints submitted by the European citizens, both to the European Commission, but as well as the petitions to the European Parliament. I've been personally involved in this process, and especially with the European Parliament, showing all the kind of contradictions in the European legislation, in the Swedish legislation, and even the European Parliament published two reports in 2009, 2016, stating that there are still persisting barriers to free movement of persons that are of practical nature, and then of course have an impact, as I said before, on the daily life for a Swedish citizen, for European citizens. The fact that you don't have a personal number, it means that you can't have access, for example, to a bank account. You are not able often to not sign a contract, an employment contract, or a tenant contract if you want to hire an apartment. You are not able, for example, to have access as European citizen to the Swedish course languages at the municipal level. So you can see that there are many obstacles, and of course, this is quite problematic from an European perspective, and how the Free Movement Directive has been implemented in the Swedish system. Let's say that the European Commission, from that point of view, has been trying to solve the issue during the several pilot procedures, where the Swedish government tried to find alternative solution in order to comply with European law. An example was the samordningsnummer, a so-called temporary number that you can obtain instead for a personal number. But we several times complained against this solution, because of course this solution is making a very clear distinction between the European citizens and other citizens as Swedish citizens. As you can understand, the fact that the person is not able to register and to be a resident and to obtain a social security number, a personnummer, is having an impact on social benefits. Not obtaining social benefits, of course, have the impact on healthcare as well. The concept of resident is to be interpreted in line with interpretation resident in the Public Registration Act, as I showed before. And there are many social benefits that the person has not access to because he doesn't have a social security number, such as child support, sick pay, disability assistance, and especially when it comes to social assistance. Often the fact that you don't hold a social security number, you are not registered as a resident, is a presumption that you don't fulfill the requirement according to the Swedish legislation, so you don't have access to social assistance either. Last but not least, the problem with the healthcare. Here we are, of course, talking about a very important category of European citizens that are fulfilling all the conditions required by the European Directive, by the Article 7, to be a worker, student, pensioners, retired persons, and non-economic active persons. So we are talking about a person that, from a formal and practical point of view, they are fulfilling all the conditions. However, if the person is not registered as a resident, according to the Swedish law, Healthcare Act, you are not able to access to the hospital for a normal healthcare control. Only if you hold the European Health Insurance Card, you will be able to get the so-called emergency assistance, healthcare assistance. So you see that person living in Sweden, the European citizens living in Sweden without a personnummer, of course, they are facing a lot of issues, practical barriers, and this can lead, of course, to destitution, and of course can lead to a lot of kind of healthcare, as Mauro said before, during this healthcare situation. It's a very big issue from this perspective. So thank you very much, and hope I have not been all the time.
Thank you, Fabrizio and Martin. Yes, we are in time, and the floor is open now for questions. We do not have any at the moment, but please do not hesitate to write them in the chat box. And maybe we can just start off by discussing a little bit. I was wondering, because in your presentations, you all mentioned that well, there's a complex set of rules for migrants, for EU mobile citizens to access different services. And I was just wondering if you could tell us, how do they get this information? As we know, many times people don't speak the language of the country where they arrive, or when they're so complex and contradictory at national level even, it is difficult to understand. Where can mobile EU citizens receive this kind of support, and do you think there's a need to extend services for legal counseling and advice? Maybe in Sweden we could try.
Well, first of all, I think it's quite hard to get the support on these issues. It is, of course, possible to turn to different social services, like and civil society in Sweden, and but normally these questions are quite complicated, and you need a lawyer to sit down and look at your case in order to be able to enforce like the right to register as a resident in Sweden, because it is quite complicated concepts, and it's hard to just get an information folder and and then go to the tax agency, for example. So civil society, but I also think that the support, the legal support within civil society needs to be increased in order to help EU citizens on these type of matters.
Well, I think it depends on which kind of mobile citizens we're talking about. I mean, if you are more or less a professional, let's say you're a trainee from an Italian trainee who has like some kind of problems in registering at the municipality in Belgium, you can find some kind of support, even like the EU Rights Clinic, which is run by Anthony Valk, who is the one who drafted the legal fitness check for Belgium. I mean, you can find that kind of support. I think it's now more or less known as other legal advice support you can find in Brussels. When you're homeless, and I mean, the kind of access to services you can have, it's can be challenging, especially if you don't speak French, you don't speak English, maybe, which sometimes might help. So I think I mean, in Brussels, there is a lack of support and advice for people who are destitute, who are in sleeping rough. Of course, you have associations like Diogene who can help, but like they have maybe 4 social workers, 2 working with specifically with Romanian nationals and 2 with Polish nationals, plus others who can help, of course. But I mean, if you're not registered, if you don't have an address, and you don't actually have access to services which are like the regional services, like the job services. So, I mean, it's quite challenging. And I think that when I used to work at FEANTSA, one of the challenges that one of the main issues that we found, not only in Brussels, also in other cities, is that really the link between services, homeless services, and legal advisors. Sometimes you have legal advisors who are experts on local issues. They don't know too much about European law, or they are not expert on European free movement law. Or maybe you have experts on European free movement law who don't know very much about homelessness issues. So there is sometimes this link between homelessness services and legal advice, which is not really existing. And the problem is that when you deal with mobile citizens, or you deal with third country nationals, say asylum seekers or beneficiaries of international protection, or migrants in transit, you need to know certain legal issues. You need to know them, and sometimes, I mean, social workers, they are not trained to do that, which is reasonable. I mean, I'm not saying that it shouldn't be the case. It's not the kind of training that you have, but I mean, this link is missing, and maybe it's something on which FEANTSA and its members should work on.
Yes, thank you for your answers. Indeed, this is something that we are trying to develop in the second phase of PRODEC, as I mentioned earlier. And yeah, more information will be available about it on our website soon. I can see that we still do not have questions that remain for us to answer. So we have 5 more minutes left. I will just remind you once again that we'll send out a link with the recording of the webinar and the presentations. And so no worries, Fabrizio, you couldn't share the screen earlier, but your presentation will be sent out in an email after the webinar to all of those who registered. And oh, something just showed up in our Q&A section, and question coming from Bianca Krista, who says, any experiences with mobile Roma?
I can reply for Brussels. I mean, the question of Roma was one of the, if you find the time to read the report, you'll find like a specific chapter about mobile Roma. I decided not to take into account that today in the presentation because in 15 minutes I didn't have time. So like Diogene as a specific a social worker, outreach worker who is Roma herself, Romanian Roma, and she mainly deals with Roma mobile citizens who are homeless in Brussels. And to be honest, in the data that looking at the data that we collected, that Diogene collected, often the situation of Roma mobile citizens is better than other nationalities, at least for Brussels and at least for the beneficiaries with whom Diogene works. So I cannot say that for all associations is the same. Mainly, one of the main reasons is that Roma mobile citizens have often like some kind of family oriented migration to Brussels, which means that they, in a way or another, they are more likely to have access to social benefits, to help for families in general, and that make them less vulnerable to certain problems like alcohol and substance abuse or mental health problems, and in relation to other nationalities. I'm not saying that the situation is wonderful. I mean, it's not because they have more access to minimum income allowances that automatically make disappear their problems. There are problems, and there are like creation of some kind of shanty towns in Brussels, which is very recent. Like until a few years ago, maybe you could find many Roma people living in overcrowded apartments and things like that. And now, since the expulsions from France of Roma people, like back in 2010, 2012, and then it kept going on, there were several Roma families who were established in France who moved to Belgium. And the same goes for like the community in Romania decided to move to Belgium rather than France. And that, of course, in a way, increased some kind of vulnerability for Roma. In any case, so I invite you to read the report if you have time, and then don't hesitate to ask questions to Simona or to myself about it.
Thank you, Mauro. I don't know if you saw there was a second part of the question that referred to discrimination and hate crime. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, or maybe Martin and Fabrizio.
Yes, I share Mauro's view regarding the Roma situation. Let's say that regarding Sweden, if we're talking about free movement rights for European citizens, from a public debate point of view, we often talk about Roma. We don't talk about European citizens. This is what has been going on for the last 6 years. So there are a lot of kind of supports within the civil society trying to help Roma people. There have been a lot of discrimination, hate crimes against Roma people on the street by, of course, right extremist persons. But there is a good support and there is a good, let's say, political will as well to support the Roma group in the society. I've been working at Crossroads, Gothenburg City Mission, for many years. And with me and Simona We've been also working together before. And we actually were working with all European citizens. Roma were part of our center. And we have always tried to work from a same perspective. You are the European citizen, you have the free movement rights, and you have the right to be registered in Sweden. Then we see that the problems are for both, for Roma people as well as for European citizens, not without Roma background.
Thank you, Fabrizio. Yes, Bianca mentions the Malmö project related to hate crime. That is, from what I know, also a Crossroads project who focuses on identifying cases of discrimination and hate crime, but also has activities on raising awareness regarding the situation of Roma across Europe. And yes, you are welcome to get in touch, Bianca, if you want contact details. We can help you with that. I think that is indeed an interesting initiative that supports Roma specifically. Yes, I think we are in good time. If there are no other questions for today or other things to mention, we have reached the end of the webinar. We remain available, as mentioned. Feel free to contact us, and we will send the information by mail from today. I would like to thank a lot our speakers for their interesting. Yes, Fabrizio?
Sorry, can I just add the last one thing? As I mentioned before, in our legal fitness check, we have also trying to make some recommendations. One of the recommendations was to, we hope that the European Commission will launch an infringement procedure against Sweden, because this issue has been going for many years. Swedish government has tried to solve the issue from a diplomatic point of view with the European Commission, but there are no improvements on that plan. So I really hope that the European Commission will take into consideration all the complaints that are still today submitted to the European Commission, the European Parliament, in order to launch an infringement procedure as soon as possible, in order to close and solve the issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that important mention. Yes, so with this, I think we will bring the webinar to a close. Thank you for your interesting presentations and for the discussion. And we are looking forward to other opportunities to continue the discussion on this topic, which is always very interesting and it needs a lot of time, of course. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.